My name is Ken Thompson, and I'm a lay member of the Marshfield United Methodist Church. I'm hoping that you will spend a few minutes listening to me talk about the Passover. This year, in the year 2024, Passover will begin on Monday, April 22nd at sundown, and last until sundown on the 29th, except in Israel, where the Passover is one day less. This date's determined by the first full moon after the vernal equinox. So what is Passover? Why is it celebrated? How is it celebrated? Jesus celebrated Passover. So did Paul, even after his life-altering encounter with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. So why don't we in the Christian church celebrate Passover? Well, let's talk about Passover and see if there are any answers to these questions. The beginnings of what has become Passover are lost in the prehistory of the Jewish people. Scholars speculate that Passover is a combination of two distinct and ancient celebrations of the people who occupied the land that is now Israel. The first, and probably older event, called Pesach, which has been translated into English as Passover, was a festival of worship and thanksgiving by nomadic people each spring, when a perfect or spotless lamb was sacrificed and eaten by each tribe or extended family, a recognition of the blessings given them by God. The second, called Hey Hamatzu, translated as Feast of Unleavened Bread, was celebrated by an agricultural community at the end of winter, when barley bread was prepared and eaten for 7 days in thanksgiving to God that he had seen them through another winter without their having starved to death. Barley flour hardly rises as it is baked, ending up hard and flat like a large unsalted cracker, like matzah. Now, fast forward hundreds of years to a time much later described by the authors and editors of the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, when the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt. God assigned Moses and his family to lead these people out of slavery in Egypt to freedom in a promised land. The Pharaoh, the absolute ruler of Egypt, was not initially agreeable to Moses' demands. To soften Pharaoh's obstinacy, God struck Egypt with a series of plagues. After the 9th plague, Pharaoh remained firm in his refusal to allow the Hebrews to leave Egypt. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 12 to read about the 10th plague. As I am only reading selected verses from the NIV translation of that chapter, you might want to take the time to read the chapter in its entirety. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be your first month, the first month of your year. Tell the whole community that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share with their nearest neighbor. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all of the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. And this is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all of the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day for you to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival of the Lord, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and another on the 7th day. Celebrate the feast of the unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Well, this chapter goes on to describe that the 10th plague God brought upon the Egyptians caused Pharaoh to, at least temporarily, consent to allow the Hebrew people to leave Egypt. In this passage, the authors and editors of Exodus describe how God commanded that the two festivals be combined into one celebration: Pesach, the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb, and Hai Hamatzo, the feast of the unleavened bread, united into one 7-day annual event to commemorate God's deliverance of the Hebrew people from slavery to freedom. Now, fast forward hundreds of more years. The Jewish people had lived in their promised land with the help of military leaders, judges, prophets, and kings. They divided their land into kingdoms, Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Israel was conquered by the Assyrians in 720 BC, and many of the people of that kingdom were enslaved. About 125 years later, the Babylonians conquered Judah and hauled many of the Jewish people into captivity in Babylon, an event known as the exile. Many biblical scholars, Jewish and Christian, believe that it was during this exile that the stories of the history of the Jewish people began to be written down, edited, and compiled, so that by the time the people were released from captivity in 538 BC and allowed to return to Judah, a facsimile of the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, accompanied them back home. It was during this time that 1st and 2nd Kings were put together with a strong dose of Deuteronomistic editing, that is, by temple-centric legalistic scholars. 2nd Kings, in describing events during the reign of King Josiah of Judah around 622 BC, before the exile, when the Book of Laws was discovered in a treasure room in Solomon's temple, gives some explanation as to how Passover became a required pilgrimage and temple event. Upon reading this newly discovered scroll, King Josiah ordered that the people of Judah obey the commands of the Lord and assemble once a year in the temple to celebrate the Passover, something that evidently had not been done for a long time. 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 21 through 23 say, "The king gave this order that all people celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant. Not since the days of the judges who led Israel, nor throughout the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, had any such Passover been observed. But in the 18th year of the king Josiah, this Passover was celebrated to the Lord in Jerusalem." Since Deuteronomy 16 says that the Pesach sacrifice must be done in the temple, King Josiah required pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem, so that on the 14th day of Nisan, the lambs were to be sacrificed, then cooked and eaten in the temple at sunset, and then the feast of unleavened bread would be celebrated for the next 7 days. When the Babylonians conquered Judah, they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. How and whether Passover was celebrated during the exile is the subject of much conjecture. But the Bible, in the book of Ezra, tells us that when the Jewish people were restored to Judah, and when the temple was rebuilt in Jerusalem, the children of captivity kept the Passover and kept the feast of unleavened bread for 7 days with joy. So from the restoration in 538 BC until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Christian era, Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were combined into one week-long celebration. Lambs were still slaughtered on the 14th day of Nisan, but the crowds grew so large that the roasting and consumption of the lambs was permitted in private homes. Jewish people traveled to Jerusalem from all over the Mediterranean world for the Passover, swelling the population of Jerusalem to 4 times its normal size. The crowds unnerved the Romans, stressed the Jewish leadership, and agitated the celebrants. The temple courtyards were packed with pilgrims, prophets, and those profiting from the pilgrims and prophets. Jesus of Nazareth was a devout Jew who celebrated Passover. The Gospel of Luke tells of Mary and Joseph taking 12-year-old Jesus to Jerusalem for the Passover. What Christians refer to as the Last Supper was part of a traditional Passover meal, most likely including unleavened bread. Jesus is recorded in the 22nd chapter of Luke as having said that he eagerly desired to eat the Passover with his disciples before he suffered. The three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record that the disciples prepared the Passover meal on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. According to the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, Paul celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread in Philippi on his third missionary journey. And prior to that event, Paul had written to the church in Corinth that the congregation should maintain the celebration of Passover. But Paul described a change in emphasis in the celebration. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, "For Christians, our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and wickedness, but with bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth." No longer were sacrifices required in the Christian celebration of Passover. But the Jewish celebrations were initially honored because to early Christians, Jesus was the culmination of the Jewish religion, the fulfillment of the covenant, and the beginning of the new covenant foretold by the prophet Jeremiah and others. Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, God's ultimate gift of grace, of freedom from slavery, the Exodus experience for all people, the Passover of God as he freed all his people from slavery and death. Within 20 years of Paul having written his letter to the Corinthians, the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Pilgrimage and the central location of sacrifices could no longer be part of the Passover event. Over the years, the rabbis developed a substitute method for continuing the Passover celebration, now set forth in the Haggadah, an order of service, a ritual and history repository, and an instruction book for the Seder, which includes the Passover meal. Readings from Jewish scripture, questions to be asked by the youngest family member present, and answers to be given by the head of the household or senior-most member present. Prayers and blessings and psalms to be sung are all set forth. A ceremonial plate, the Seder plate, partitioned so as to separate the items, is to contain roasted shank bone, that is the paschal sacrifice, an egg representing spring and new life, bitter herbs, a reminder of slavery, the aroset, which is made from a mash of apples, nuts, wine, and cinnamon, perhaps a symbol of the mortar used by the Jewish people in their Egyptian slavery, karpa, often parsley, a reminder of spring, and 3 pieces of matzah, the unleavened bread. Also required are bowls of salt water for dipping, symbol of the tears and sweat of slavery, and glasses for 4 drinks of wine for each celebrant, and 1 more glass to be filled for the always expected guest, Elijah, for whom the door is left ajar. In modern times, some Jewish households add a cup of water for Miriam, Moses' sister, a tribute to the importance of women during the Exodus. About halfway through the Haggadah prescribed Seder, a family meal is served. Traditionally, matzo ball soup, poached fish patties called gefilte fish, beef brisket or chicken, and potatoes. No chametz is allowed, that is, no leavened grains during the entire 7-day celebration, so no bread, cookies, pasta, cereal, or cakes. The focus of the modern Seder is on the historic redemption of the Jewish people by God, known as the Exodus, and on an expression of hope for God's future redemption of his people. Sadly, in the centuries following the destruction of the Second Temple, recognition and celebration of a Passover festival became affected by the virulent anti-Semitism which pervaded the Christian church as it gained political power. Nominal Christians committed unspeakable acts of barbarism in attempting to convert Jews by torture. The Jewish people were increasingly isolated from full participation in civil society, and Jewish property was appropriated without adequate compensation. The celebration of Jewish festivals such as Passover, even though Jesus and Paul had celebrated them, were declared to be anathema, sinful to the point of risking excommunication from the church. Despite lingering vestiges of anti-Semitism among some in the Christian congregations today, there has been a revival in the recognition of the spiritual kinship of Jews and Christians, an understanding that the history of both faiths began with God's creation of the earth and with God's original covenant with Abraham and his descendants. We are both related to Moses by faith, a far closer bond than DNA. We worship the same God. The Christian Savior was a Jew. And as Paul wrote in chapter 11 of Romans, and so all Israel will be saved. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs, for God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. For God has bound all men over to disobedience, so that he may have mercy on them all. In recognition of the common faith inheritance of Judaism and Christianity, some Christian congregations celebrate Passover today with a Seder meal, similar to that of the Haggadah, commemorating God's gift of freedom from slavery given to all of us. Not because we're entitled, but by God's loving grace. Happy Passover.